joined from Brussels by Mr. Nicholas Williams, a former NATO official. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Let's start off asking, after Russia allegedly jammed von der Leyen's plane, is this the new face of some sort of hybrid warfare, and is Europe ready to respond to such an act?
I don't think it's a new face. It's the most prominent face that we've experienced. So a year ago, the British Defence Minister, airplane flying near Kaliningrad, faced the same sort of incident. And I think this is ever numerous event, and it's an ever numerous and more risky intervention by the Russians. The Russians are fighting a hybrid war. They think they're at war with the West already.
So do you think, sir, that this is a scare tactic, or is this like an intentional attempt to, attempt to assassinate some sort of leader?
I don't think it's an attempt to assassinate, and it may not even have been the Russians deliberately doing this, but it's probable. And it's a sign that whatever talk of peace there is, these blocs, as you call them, Russia and the West, and particularly the Europeans, are antagonists. They're staunch antagonists. They're not in a process of negotiating a peace process.
Okay, with the GPS attacks over Bulgaria, can Europe's air travel and defense systems withstand a wider wave of electronic sabotage if Russia chooses to do so?
Well, there are alternatives to GPS. The plane landed, yes, manually, but there are alternatives, and the EU is working on countermeasures and as a warning to Russia. But yes, it's a nuisance, to put it mildly, and it can be a dangerous nuisance, but the Europeans will not be severely affected by these incidents.
But if there are cyber attacks, for instance, because the Russians are fully capable of doing so, if this does happen, do you think that the Europeans are ready or prepared to withstand such an attack?
Well, the Europeans for 10 or even more years have been insulating themselves from cyber attacks, and are particularly aware of the danger from Russia and even China. The issue is, though, not be able to defend themselves, but to proactively send a signal to Russia by doing their own counter measures to damage Russian systems. But I don't think the Europeans are willing to do that because they don't want to escalate the contention with Russia.
But we've also seen statements coming out, for instance, from von der Leyen calling Putin, quote, a predator. Does this blunt language mark some sort of shift from diplomacy to more of deterrence when it comes to the EU strategy, and they're going to be a bit more aggressive towards Russia?
Well, I think that von der Leyen is particularly outspoken in her condemnation of Russia, and her visit to the Baltic states and Eastern Europe has confirmed that. The Russians see her as an anti-Russian agitator, and it wouldn't surprise me if they deliberately targeted for her aircraft disruption. But she's only speaking for the great sentiment of the Europeans and the UK. So yes, she doesn't restrain herself from her language, but this is the diplomatic situation we find ourselves in which both sides criticize and use harsh language about the other.
Well, but I mean, you talked a bit about the Baltic visit itself. Her visit highlights Baltic and Balkan security in general. That's the whole point. Is the EU finally uniting defence policy around the common frontline threat?
Well, it's uniting its efforts to, first of all, support European EU defence industry, to bolster it, to increase their capacities. Secondly, they're uniting in the need to spend more money on defence. That's what von der Leyen has emphasized in this visit, and the EU will help its member states spend more money by loans and by various mechanisms. But they're not uniting as an EU member. They leave most of the collective defense of the West to NATO, and not even NATO, this coalition of the willing, which is 30 countries, most of them NATO, is planning an intervention in Ukraine as a reassurance and deterrence force against Russia once this war.
But can Europe actually depend on NATO, given the fact that Donald Trump is scaling back basically on NATO spending?
Well, the Europeans realize that they can't depend entirely on NATO, and the Hague Summit, NATO Hague Summit, where everyone bowed obeisance to Trump, was intended to buy time in order to make arrangements for the Europeans to lessen their dependence on NATO. But for the moment, NATO is all that the Europeans have in terms of collective defense.
Well, with plans for long-term Western troops in Ukraine, as you talked about earlier, is this the birth of a new NATO-backed security order in Eastern Europe? You said that NATO, they're depending on it, or Europeans are depending on it for the moment, but there are plans for future, security measures for Eastern Europe.
Well, and this is a fault line within Europe. The French particularly want a Europe in partnership with the United States, but not dependent on the United States. The British, the Germans to an extent, the Italians, Poles want absolutely American commitment to Europe, because it's the only thing with American nuclear weapons that can absolutely deter Russia. Russia is only frightened of the United States. So there's a split within the Europeans, but in terms of the next steps, trying to make Europe less reliant, not unreliant, but less reliant, everyone has agreed.
Well, as you said there, sir, that there are some divisions when it comes to the vision for the future. Now, Bulgaria is now considered an arms hub. Can the EU boost its defence production without deepening further, the internal divisions there?
Well, Bulgaria, alongside, say, the Czech Republic, it's also a major producer of artillery shells and basic war material, are being encouraged by the Europeans, all Europeans, to expand their defense capabilities and capacities. I think the problem comes with this high-tech air defense, which only the Americans have the ability to produce a sufficient amount of air defense. And the Europeans are far behind in an essential component of a collective defense, which is air defense, and also space communications.
Well, von der Leyen's tour also took her to Finland and Romania and a number of other countries. Does this tour signify or prove that basically Europe is finally acting more like a geopolitical power, not just an economic bloc? Because one of the things that people have criticized, I suppose, when it comes to the EU, is that they're very dependent on the US for security. Does this prove otherwise?
Yes, I agree with the sentiment behind your question. I don't think it proves that the Europeans are at last acting as a strategic actor. It it proves that at least the Europeans and the European Commission is trying to act as a strategic actor. But there's a long way between trying and doing and succeeding. And in the next few years, if von der Leyen's vision succeeds with increased defense expenditure, increased responsibility for the Europeans, maybe we will see some changes and some difference. But it will take a few years yet.
Well, other than the security aspect of it all, do you think or expect that there could be a political solution to the ongoing challenges that Europe is facing right now with the Ukraine-Russia war?
Paradoxically, all this talk about reassurance forces, security guarantees backed by significant military power makes the Russians even more determined to win this war on the battlefield. They will not, in my view, accept the ideas of the West, of the Europeans, for a strong European backing, military backing, and guaranteed assurance for Ukraine.
Okay, thank you so much. That was Mr. Nicholas Williams, a former NATO official. Thank you for your insights.